The morning Jane Shelton hurled Elijah Vaughn's letter into the fireplace without so much as breaking the wax seal. She told herself she felt nothing, and it was the most convincing lie she had ever told. The year was 1874, and the town of Caldwell Creek, Kansas sat baking under a late summer sun that had no patience for sentiment. Caldwell Creek was the kind of place that swallowed people whole if they let their guard down. A raw, red dirt settlement of maybe 300 souls pressed between the rolling prairie to the east and the limestone bluffs to the west, with a single main street that turned to mud every time the clouds opened up and to choking dust every time they did not. There was a livery, a general store run by the Patton family, a barbershop that doubled as the town's unofficial bank, a saloon called the Spur and Wheel, and a little white church at the end of the road that looked like someone had forgotten to finish building it. The railroad had passed 20 miles to the north, which meant Caldwell Creek stayed small, stayed stubborn, and stayed the kind of place where gossip traveled faster than any locomotive. Jane Shelton was 24 years old, and she had lived in Caldwell Creek her entire life, which she considered either a blessing or a curse depending on the hour. She was not what the women's magazines of the era would have called a delicate beauty, but she was striking in the way that open country is striking. All strong lines and clear eyes, and a quality of stillness that made people pay attention when she finally decided to speak. Her hair was dark brown, and she wore it in a practical braid that fell between her shoulder blades, and her hands were rough from the work of running the Shelton homestead since her father had died 18 months prior, leaving her and her younger sister, Clara, who was 19, to manage 40 acres of wheat and a stubbornness that could outlast any drought. Elijah Vaughn was 27, and he had arrived in Caldwell Creek the previous spring aboard a wagon loaded with fence posts, and a reputation that preceded him by about 3 counties. He was a foreman for the Harlan Cattle Company, which ran a significant operation 6 miles outside of town, and he had come to Caldwell Creek to hire hands, negotiate grazing rights, and generally conduct the business of cattle in a region where cattle was essentially the entire point of existence. He was tall in the way that men who spent their lives on horseback tended to be tall, loose-limbed, and easy in the saddle, but somehow more solid than he appeared when he stood on the ground. He had dark blonde hair that the sun had been working on for years, turning it the color of dried hay at the temples, and his eyes were a complicated shade of gray that changed with the light and the weather and whatever mood he happened to be carrying. The two of them had met in the Patton General Store on a Thursday afternoon in May, when Jane had come to collect a bolt of calico she had ordered for Clara's birthday dress, and Elijah had come to purchase ammunition and a new set of leather-work gloves. They had reached for the same bolt of fabric at the same moment, Jane because Mr. Patton had set it on the wrong shelf and she had been reaching to check the color in better light, and Elijah because he had apparently never in his life seen a bolt of fabric that did not require his immediate inspection. Jane had snatched her hand back. He had apologized. She had said it was fine, when clearly it was only fine in the technical sense that no harm had been done. He had said something about the color being pretty, meaning the calico, and she had assumed he was being forward and given him a look that could have stripped paint off a barn door. He had not been deterred. That was the thing about Elijah Vaughn that Jane would come to understand only gradually, the way you understand a river, not all at once but piece by piece as you wade further in. He was not easily discouraged. Not because he was arrogant or thick-skinned, but because he genuinely believed that most things worth having required patience, and he applied this principle to horses, to cattle, to difficult stretches of fence line, and apparently to women who looked at him like he was something they had scraped off their boot. He had introduced himself properly that afternoon. She had told him her name with the bare minimum of warmth required by the social conventions of a small western town. He had tipped his hat and gone to pay for his ammunition, and she had taken her calico and gone home, and that should have been the end of it. But Caldwell Creek was a small town, as has been established, and small towns have their own ideas about what should and should not end. Over the following weeks, Jane saw Elijah with the relentless frequency that a small community produces at the church on Sunday mornings, where he sat 3 pews behind her, and sang the hymns with the modest competence of a man who had been raised right but not raised musical. At the Patton store, where they seemed to have developed an unfortunate habit of needing supplies on the same days. At the town's monthly social gathering held in the church fellowship hall, where the tables were pushed back and someone brought a fiddle and Caldwell Creek's residents danced away the particular loneliness that the prairie could grind into a person over time. At the June social, Elijah had asked Jane to dance. She had declined, citing a headache that was not entirely invented but was perhaps more manageable than she let on. At the July social, he had asked again, and she had said she was tired, which was the truth. She had spent 14 hours in the wheat fields that week and her back ached in a way she refused to acknowledge aloud because acknowledging it felt like surrendering. He had nodded as though her answer made perfect sense and had brought her a cup of lemonade without her asking, setting it on the table beside her and walking away before she could decide whether to be grateful or suspicious. She had drunk the lemonade. It had been excellent lemonade. She had not thanked him, which she felt guilty about later, alone in her house with the prairie wind pressing against the walls and her guilt pressing against her from the inside. It was Clara who first said out loud what the entire town was apparently whispering. Clara had a gift for naming the things that everyone was thinking but no one was saying, which made her both indispensable and occasionally maddening. "Elijah Vaughn is sweet on you," Clara announced one morning in August, sitting at the kitchen table shelling beans with the serene confidence of someone delivering obvious information to a slow pupil. "Elijah Vaughn is a cattle foreman who knows everyone in the county," Jane said, stirring the pot on the stove with unnecessary vigor. "Being pleasant to people is part of his job. He brought you lemonade. It was hot. He watched you walk home from church last Sunday. People look around. That is what eyes are for." Clara set down a bean pod and looked at her sister with the particular patience of someone who has decided to outlast an argument rather than win it. "Jane," she said very gently, "Papa has been gone a year and a half." The kitchen went quiet except for the sound of the stove and the wind. Jane set down the spoon. "I know how long he has been gone," she said, and her voice was steady because she had learned to make it steady, which was not the same thing as it actually being steady underneath. She did not bring up Elijah Vaughn's name again that day, and neither did Clara, who understood the architecture of her sister's grief well enough to know when to step back from a door. The letter arrived on the 17th of August. Mr. Harold Tibbs, who served as Caldwell Creek's postmaster out of a small room annexed to the barber shop, handed it to Jane on a Tuesday morning when she came to town for feed supplies. He handed it over with the carefully neutral expression of a postmaster who has read enough of other people's business through the envelopes, without opening them, to know when a letter is significant. Jane took it with steady hands and looked at the front. Her name was written there in a clear, careful script, not the looping extravagance of a man trying to impress, but the honest, deliberate handwriting of someone who took care with what he said and how he said it. There was no return address written on the envelope, but she knew the handwriting. She had seen it on the cattle company's order slips at the Patton store. She had perhaps studied it once or twice more than was strictly necessary. She put the letter in her coat pocket and drove the wagon home and unloaded the feed and cooked the midday meal and ate it with Clara and discussed the state of the wheat and whether the late-season rains would be enough and whether Mrs. Connolly at the church had been deliberately unkind when she remarked on Jane's dress last Sunday or merely thoughtless. And then, after all of that, Jane went to her room and took the letter from her coat pocket and sat on the edge of her bed with it in her hands. She sat there for a long time. The fear was not a simple thing, and she was honest enough with herself, in the privacy of her own room, to call it what it was. It was not that she disliked Elijah Vaughn. It was that she was beginning to suspect she might like him considerably, and liking someone considerably left you open to loss, and loss was something she had experience with, and the experience had not been pleasant. Her father had been a good man and a present father, and she had watched him sicken over 6 months and die on a cold January morning, with the snow coming down outside the window. And the shape of that absence was still something she moved around carefully, the way you move around furniture in a dark room. She sat with the letter until the light changed. Then she put it back in her coat pocket, took it downstairs, walked to the fireplace and dropped it in without opening it. She watched the paper curl and blacken and become nothing. She told herself she felt nothing. Clara came into the room and saw Jane standing at the fireplace with empty hands and a face like a closed door, and Clara, to her considerable credit, did not say a word. The next morning, Jane went to town for the egg crates she had forgotten in her errand the day before, and Elijah Vaughn was at the patent store, and their eyes met across the dim interior of the shop. And Jane said good morning with the precise warmth of a woman who has burned a letter and intends to maintain that position. And Elijah said good morning back with the precise warmth of a man who suspects something has happened, but has not yet decided what to do about it. He tipped his hat. She bought her egg crates. The summer burned on. September came in dry and golden, the kind of September that Kansas produces when it is trying to apologize for the summer it just delivered. The wheat was good this year, genuinely good, and Jane and Clara worked dawn to dusk bringing in the harvest with the help of their neighbor Tom Whitfield, who was 60 years old and had worked alongside their father for 2 decades, and who showed up every harvest without being asked, which was one of the kindest things Jane had ever encountered in human behavior. It was during the harvest that Elijah Vaughn did something that Jane had not anticipated, which was that he showed up. He rode in on a Thursday morning on his big chestnut gelding, not in his foreman's capacity but in the capacity of a man who has decided to be useful, and he dismounted and tied the horse to the fence and rolled up his sleeves and looked at Jane with gray eyes that held both a question and an answer at the same time. "I heard you're short a hand this week," he said. "Whitfield's wife is unwell and he's with her." Jane had not known about Mrs. Whitfield. She filed that information away for later, for the pie she would bring when the harvest was done, and then she returned her attention to the present problem of Elijah Vaughn standing in her wheat field looking like he fully intended to stay there. "I am not Charity," she said. "I did not say you were," he replied. "I said you're short a hand. I have 2 of them and no pressing business until sundown. That seems like a straightforward arithmetic problem." Clara, who had been standing 10 feet away and pretending to check the condition of a fence post with excessive interest, made a sound that was technically a cough. Jane looked at the wheat. She looked at the sky, which was clear and good but would not stay that way forever. She looked at Elijah, who was watching her with the patient, attentive quality that she had come to recognize as his particular way of existing in the world. "You take the north section," she said finally. "I will take the south." He nodded and went to work. He was a good worker. Jane noticed this with the automatic assessment of someone who has spent years evaluating practical competence, because practical competence is what keeps a farm alive. He moved efficiently, without waste, and he did not make conversation while working because he understood, as many people did not, that working and talking were 2 different activities that did not always improve each other. He worked until the light failed, and then he picked up his hat, which he had removed and hung on a fence post 3 hours earlier, and he walked to where Jane was tying the last of the bundles. "Thank you," she said, because she was honest always, even when honesty was inconvenient. "My pleasure, Miss Shelton," he said. There was a pause. The evening star had appeared in the western sky, and the air had that particular September quality of coolness arriving like a gift after a day of sun. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked, because it was the right thing to ask, because Clara had made enough stew to feed 4 people, and because she was not going to analyze any further motivation beyond those 2 points. He said yes. Clara set the table with 3 plates and lit the lamp and ladled the stew and produced a loaf of bread she had baked that morning. And the 3 of them sat down at the kitchen table that Jane's father had built with his own hands. And Elijah Vaughn ate and talked and listened in the comfortable proportion that made good company good. He asked Clara about her sewing, having seen a quilt through the doorway that was clearly exceptional work. Clara brightened and talked about the pattern, which she had adapted from a magazine, and Elijah asked genuine questions about it that demonstrated he was actually listening. He told them about a ranch he had worked on in Texas before coming north, and about the longhorn cattle that were like moving arguments on 4 legs, and about a horse he had once known that could open any gate on any fence regardless of the latch design, which had been an extraordinary nuisance and also, he admitted, something he had privately admired. Jane found herself laughing twice during supper. Genuine laughter, not the polite social version. It startled her both times, the sound of it in her own house, and she noticed Elijah noticing, though he was tactful enough not to remark on it. He left after supper with a hat tip at the door and a thank you for the meal, and Jane stood in the doorway and watched him ride off into the September dark, and then she went back inside and washed the dishes. Clara sat at the table and worked on her sewing and said absolutely nothing, which was a heroic act of self-restraint that Jane appreciated more than she could say. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Not every day, not so much that it became something to talk about or something to navigate, just often enough. He would appear in the morning, work the section that most needed doing, eat whatever was offered for supper with honest appreciation, and leave when it was time to leave. After the harvest was in, he still came, because there was always something on a farm that needed doing, and he seemed to understand that asking permission every time was a formality that they had moved past. What was happening between them was not announced or declared. It existed in the space between things, in the way he automatically handed her tools before she asked for them, and in the way she left the lamp burning in the window on evenings she thought he might come by, and in the conversations that stretched longer and longer each time, moving from practical matters to the kind of things that people only say when they have decided, without formally deciding, to trust someone. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his mother who had been a school teacher and his father who had been a difficult man in the specific way that some men of that generation were difficult, not cruel exactly, but closed off in the way that land can close off when the water table drops, hardened and unreachable. He told her this plainly, without self-pity, the way you report weather. She told him about her father, which she had not told many people, not the true version. She told him about the man her father had actually been, his laugh, which was enormous and slightly embarrassing in church, his habit of talking to the wheat as he walked the fields, the way he had danced with her mother in the kitchen when he thought no one was watching, and the way he had sat with Jane for hours the summer she was 12 and teaching her to read the sky for weather, and she had understood only later that he was teaching her something larger than meteorology. Elijah listened to all of this. He did not try to fix it or lighten it or move past it quickly. He just received it, the way good ground receives rain. In October, he helped her repair the roof of the smaller barn, which had developed a series of alarming gaps over the summer. They spent an entire Saturday on top of that barn with hammers and shingles in the sharp autumn air, and somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, sitting up on the ridge of the roof with the whole sweep of the Kansas prairie running out in every direction, and the sky enormous and blue above them. Jane looked at Elijah and thought, with a clarity that was almost alarming, that she was in considerable trouble. He was looking out at the prairie when she looked at him, and there was something on his face that she had not seen on most people's faces in her life, a kind of openness, an undefended quality, as though the landscape did something to him that made pretense unnecessary. Then he turned and caught her looking, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the wind moved across the roof and carried the smell of dry grass and distant autumn, and Jane looked away first. "We should finish the east section before the light changes," she said. "Yes," he agreed, and they went back to work and nothing was said, but something had shifted that could not be unshifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them knew quite what to do with the knowledge. It was in November that things went sideways. The trouble did not come from the land or the weather or anything so straightforward. It came, as so much trouble does, from another person. Specifically, it came from a man named Randall Mercer, who was the second son of the Mercer family, who owned the largest hardware business in the next town over, and who had been, in his own estimation, a prospective match for Jane Shelton for approximately the last 3 years. Randall Mercer was 31, and he was not a bad man in the criminal sense of the word, but he was a man who confused his own preferences with other people's obligations, which is a particular and common variety of not goodness that causes considerable damage in the world. Randall had heard, through the reliable mechanism of prairie gossip, that Elijah Vaughn had been spending significant time at the Shelton homestead. He had ridden to Caldwell Creek to investigate, and he had found Elijah and Jane together at the general store choosing winter supplies with the easy, natural coordination of two people who had learned each other's habits. And Randall's face had done something unpleasant that Jane noticed and filed away. The following Sunday, after church, Randall had cornered Jane by the water trough while the rest of the congregation dispersed, and he had said, with a particular mixture of possession and concern that she found genuinely offensive, that he hoped she understood that entertaining a cattle company foreman was not going to do her reputation any good. Jane had looked at Randall Mercer for a long, considered moment. "Thank you for your concern," she said, and walked away, which was a much more restrained response than the one she had wanted to give, but she was in church clothes and there were children present. What she did not know, and would learn later, was that Randall had then gone to speak to Elijah, whom he found at the spur and wheel having a quiet beer before the ride back to the cattle company. What passed between them was not witnessed in full by anyone, but the version that reached Jane via Clara, who had it from the barber's wife, who had it from the barber, who had been in the saloon minding a different conversation entirely, was that Randall had suggested, with varying degrees of directness, that Elijah had no legitimate intentions toward Jane Shelton, and that a man in his position had no business at a widow's farm, at which point Elijah had set down his beer, said something short and quiet that no one caught clearly, and walked out. Jane heard this version of events 2 days later, and her reaction was complicated. She was angry at Randall, which was simple and satisfying. She was less comfortable with the question that had surfaced underneath the anger, which was the question of what Elijah's intentions actually were, and whether she wanted them to be what she was beginning to suspect they were, and whether she was ready for that, and whether ready was even a thing that applied here, or whether she was using readiness as a polite word for something else. She was still wrestling with this when the second letter arrived. It came on the 5th of November, again through Mr. Tibbs at the post office, again in that honest, careful handwriting. Jane looked at it for a long time in the pale gray light of a November morning. The envelope was sealed with plain brown wax. Her name was on the front. His name was not on the back, but she knew it in her chest before her mind had even finished processing the handwriting. She went home. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her and her tea going cold beside it. Clara was at the neighbor's, helping Mrs. Whitfield, who was recovered from her illness but still needed assistance with certain tasks. The house was quiet. The stove ticked. The prairie wind worked at the corners of the house with patient, methodical attention. Jane thought about the first letter, gone to ash in August. She thought about everything that had happened since August. She thought about a man sitting on the ridge of a barn roof looking out at the prairie with an undefended face. She picked up the letter. She turned it over in her hands. She ran her thumb along the sealed edge. She set it down. She picked it up again. She held it at arm's length as though the distance might clarify something. Then she put it back on the table with slightly more force than was necessary, pushed back her chair, went and found her coat and her hat, and drove the wagon into town. She found Mr. Tibbs in his small post-office room and handed him the letter across the counter with a hand that did not shake at all, because she had very good control of her hands. "Return this to the sender," she said. Mr. Tibbs looked at the letter. He looked at Jane. He was a small, careful man who had held his position through 4 different town councils and 3 droughts and a cattle plague by the simple philosophy of never commenting on anyone's personal business, and he held to that philosophy now. He took the letter. "Certainly, Miss Shelton," he said. She drove home. She made fresh tea. She sat at the table and drank it. She did not look at the fireplace. 3 days passed. Jane worked the farm, checked the wheat stores, fixed a loose hinge on the chicken coop, corresponded with a seed supplier in Wichita about spring planting, and did not think about Elijah Vaughn, which was something she was doing with such sustained effort that the effort itself proved the opposite of what she intended. On the 4th day, a package arrived, not through the post office. It was brought by a young ranch hand from the cattle company, a boy of about 17 named Pete, who knocked on the farmhouse door at mid-morning and handed Jane a small parcel wrapped in brown paper with his hat in his other hand. "Mr. Vaughn asked me to deliver this personally, ma'am," Pete said. He said there was no need for a reply. Jane took the parcel. Pete replaced his hat and rode away with the relief of a person who has delivered something significant and is glad to be done with it. Jane stood in the doorway and looked at the parcel. It was small and square and wrapped with the deliberate neatness of someone who had given the wrapping genuine attention. She brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table. She opened it. Inside was the letter. Her letter, the second one with the wax seal unbroken, still sealed, still intact. She recognized the brown wax and the small imprint that the seal had left. He had not opened it. He had not tried to make her read it by any other means. He had just sent it back to her, but there was something new. On the back of the envelope below where a return address might have gone, he had written a single line, not in the letter which was still sealed and private and unread. On the outside where she could not avoid seeing it without destroying the envelope. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she sat down in the kitchen chair, because her legs had made a unilateral decision about the situation. The line read, "I am not going anywhere, Jane, and I am not in any hurry, but I want you to know I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever had the good fortune to sit beside on a barn roof." She sat with that for a long time. The fire in the stove crackled. The wind talked to the windows. Somewhere outside, the chickens were having a disagreement about something, which they did approximately every 40 minutes regardless of what was happening in the wider world. Jane set the letter gently on the table, smoothed the brown paper wrapping, folded her hands in her lap, and thought about every version of herself that had ever burned a letter or returned one unopened, all the careful, armored versions, and she looked at them with something like compassion, because they had been doing what they knew how to do. Then she picked up the letter and slid her thumb under the wax seal and opened it. His handwriting was the same inside as out, careful, unhurried, direct. He did not begin with poetry or extravagant declarations. He began by saying that he understood if she wanted no correspondence at all, and that he would respect that completely, but that since they seemed to keep encountering each other in a town of 300 people, he thought honesty might be more comfortable than pretense for both of them. He said he had come to Caldwell Creek intending to do the business of cattle, which he had done, and he had not anticipated Jane Shelton, which he said as a plain statement of fact, the way you report weather. He said that he found her intelligence, her humor, her stubbornness, her competence, and the particular way she looked at the world genuinely extraordinary, and that he was aware he was a cattle foreman with no land of his own and no claim on her consideration, but that he would rather say so honestly than have her wonder. He said he was not asking her for anything. He said he was just here, present, and that if she ever wanted to talk about any of this, he would be available for that conversation, and if she never did, he would continue to be a useful neighbor and a decent person and leave it at that. He signed it, Elijah Vaughn, just his name, no elaboration, no pressure. Jane read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully along its original folds and held it in both hands and looked out the window at the November sky, which was the particular shade of pale silver gray that Kansas sky becomes in late autumn, vast and beautiful and indifferent to human drama in the way that only very old, very large things can be. She got up. She put on her coat and her hat. She did not take the wagon this time. She walked. The cattle company was 6 miles from the Shelton homestead, which was a long walk in November with the cold coming in from the north. But Jane had always been a good walker, and the cold felt appropriate, bracing, clarifying, the kind of cold that makes you certain about things. She arrived at the gate of the Harlan Cattle Company's main yard in the early afternoon, her breath making small clouds in the air, her cheeks bright red from the wind. A different ranch hand at the gate, not Pete, an older man with a mustache, told her that Mr. Vaughn was in the south pasture checking on a section of fence, and pointed her in the right direction. She found him exactly where the hand had said, crouched down beside a stretch of wire fence with tools in his hands, examining a section where the posts had shifted. He heard her footsteps and stood up and turned around, and when he saw her, something moved across his face that was too quick and too honest to be managed: surprise, and underneath the surprise something else, something that he then set about quietly controlling because he was a man who had learned not to impose his feelings on other people's situations. "Miss Shelton," he said, "you wrote me a letter," she said. "I did. I returned it. I know. And then you sent it back." "I did." She looked at him, he looked at her. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of dried grass and cold earth and the distant animal warmth of the cattle in the pasture. "You wrote something on the outside," she said. "I did." That was, she paused, and she was not a woman who paused because she could not find words. She was a woman who paused because she was choosing them carefully. That was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I have seen a person do. He considered that. "Maybe both," he said. Something in her chest moved in a way she could not entirely categorize, and she looked down at the winter grass for a moment and then back up at him. "I am not," she said slowly, "particularly easy." "I noticed," he said, and there was no edge to it, no critique, just observation. "My father died and I have been running this farm alone for a year and a half, and I am not good at—" She stopped and started again. "I am not practiced at letting people in." "I know," he said, "and I burned your first letter." He almost smiled. "I know that too. I returned your second one. Also aware. And then I walked 6 miles in the cold to find you in a pasture," she said. He looked at her with those complicated gray eyes, and the almost smile became something more complete. "Yes," he said, "you did." The wind pushed at both of them. The cattle shifted and moved somewhere behind him with the enormous, unhurried motion of large animals who have no particular opinion about human love stories. The pale winter sky held everything still for a moment, the way the sky sometimes does, as though it too is waiting to see what happens. "I read your letter," Jane said. "I am glad," he said. "All of it. All right. Every word." "Jane," he said, very quietly, and just that, just her name, which he had not used before without the formal miss before it, and somehow the sound of just her name in his voice was. She did not have the precise word for it, but it landed somewhere important. She took a step toward him. He stayed exactly where he was, which was the right thing to do, and she appreciated it. "I have a farm," she said. "You do. And a sister, Clara, yes. And 40 acres of wheat and a small barn with a new roof and a flock of chickens that argue constantly." "They sound like reasonable chickens," he said. "I am not going to leave it," she said. "Any of it. I want to be clear about that." "I would not ask you to," he said, and his voice was level and his eyes were steady, and she believed him, which was itself an extraordinary thing, that she believed him. She looked at him for another long moment. The cold was thorough and real around her, and she was aware of the distance she had walked and the distance she had been keeping and the letter in her coat pocket, folded along its original creases. "Would you like to come for supper on Friday?" she asked, as something deliberate rather than a neighbor dropping by. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing his words with the same care he always did. "I would like that very much," he said. She nodded. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. She began the 6-mile walk back with the knowledge that she had, at some point in the last hour, made a decision that was going to change the shape of her life. And the remarkable thing was that the knowledge did not frighten her. It felt, instead, like the moment when you have been navigating by feel in a dark room, and your hand finally finds the lamp. Friday's supper was the beginning. Clara made a roast because this was a significant occasion, and Clara knew it. And she set the good plates and lit the lamp early, so the house was warm and golden when Elijah arrived at 6 o'clock with his hat in his hands, and a jar of apple preserves from the cattle company cook, whom he had apparently persuaded to part with them through means that were never entirely explained. The three of them ate and talked, and the difference from every previous supper was subtle but total. The way a landscape changes when the light shifts, even though nothing in the landscape itself has moved. There was no longer any pretense of mere neighborliness. There was something acknowledged between Jane and Elijah now, something that did not yet have a defined shape but had been agreed to exist, and that agreement made everything easier and warmer and more honest. After supper, Clara very transparently remembered something she needed to do in the other room, and excused herself with the grace of someone who had been waiting all evening for the appropriate moment to exit. Elijah and Jane sat by the stove with 2 cups of coffee, and the fire ticked between them, and the night pressed against the windows. "Can I ask you something?" Jane said. "Yes. The line you wrote on the outside of the envelope. Did you think it would work?" Turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I did not think of it in those terms," he said. "I thought that if you were going to return it again without reading it, at least you would have read one true thing, and that seemed better than nothing." Jane looked at the fire. "One true thing," she repeated. "Yes. That I am the most remarkable person you have sat on a barn roof with," she said, and there was something light in her voice now, something that had not been there before in conversations about this, and he heard it. "To be completely accurate," he said, also with lightness, "I have sat on very few barn roofs with anyone, so the sample is limited. But I stand by the statement in absolute terms, not just relative." She looked at him then, and she was smiling, and her smile was one of those smiles that changes a face completely, that opens it up into something generous and bright, and he looked at her with an expression that he did not try to manage or moderate, because there was no longer any need. December arrived, and with it came the cold in earnest, the hard, serious Kansas cold that is not interested in the pastoral prettiness of snow scenes in illustrated magazines, but is instead a practical and relentless force that requires good preparation and does not forgive shortcuts. Jane had the farm prepared as she always had it prepared, because preparedness was her mode of existence. The wheat was stored, the animals were housed, the wood was stacked, the provisions were ordered. Elijah came for supper on Fridays, and on some Saturdays he came to help with whatever needed doing, and the line between helpful neighbor and something else had blurred and been crossed and was no longer a line worth navigating around. They walked together in the late afternoons when the work was done, across the frozen fields where the grass was pale and brittle under a sky that went from blue to pink to a spectacular cold violet at sunset, and they talked. They talked about everything, with the thoroughness that 2 people apply to each other when they are genuinely interested. Her childhood in Caldwell Creek, his years in Texas, the things that frightened them, the things that mattered, the small and particular observations about the world that people only share when they have decided to be known. On one such walk in the 3rd week of December, with the sun going down in a blaze of red and orange that turned the snow on the fields into something extravagant, Elijah stopped walking and Jane stopped beside him, and the sunset was enormous around them. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "I have some savings," he said. 3 years of saving, which is not a fortune, but it is not nothing. I have been thinking about land." She was quiet, listening. "There is a parcel that borders your eastern field," he said. 60 acres. It came available in September. I have been looking at it." Jane was very still. "You have been thinking about that parcel," she said. "Yes." "Since September." "Since before September, truthfully, since about June, but particularly since September." She looked at him. The sunset was doing extraordinary things to the sky behind him, but she was not looking at the sky. "Elijah," she said. "Yes. Are you telling me you want to buy land next to mine?" "I am." "Because you intend to stay in Caldwell Creek?" "I do. And you wanted me to know that before you did it." "I thought you should," he said, "because it is relevant to what I am hoping." She breathed in the cold air and felt it clean and cold in her chest. The red was deepening to violet now, and the first star was out, the evening star that she had watched come out on the night she had first asked him to stay for supper. "What are you hoping, exactly?" she said, and her voice was quiet and direct, because she was a direct woman. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "I am hoping to marry you," he said, in exactly the same tone he used to discuss fence posts and wheat and anything else that mattered. "Not immediately if you need time, but that is where I am hoping this goes. I think you should know that." The field was silent around them. The cold was clean and honest. The violet deepened. Jane stood in it for a moment in the last light of the December day, with this man beside her who had written her 2 letters and sent one back and waited without impatience and been honest without pressure. And she thought about all the different kinds of courage there were, and which one she was going to need right now. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like that, in time, when it is right." The expression on his face was something she thought she would remember for the rest of her life, not triumphant, nothing like that, but something very still and very warm, like a lamp turned up in a window. "That is all I needed to know," he said. They walked back to the farmhouse in the dark with the stars coming out overhead, not holding hands yet because that was not a thing they had done, but close enough that their shoulders touched occasionally and neither of them stepped away. And that was, in its way, more than enough. Christmas in Caldwell Creek was a modest affair by the standards of larger places, but significant by its own standards, which were the only ones that mattered. The church was decorated with pine boughs that someone had hauled in from 20 miles away, and there was a gathering on Christmas Eve where the whole town came, and the fiddle played, and the children ran wild, and the adults stood around the edges with cider and conversation. Elijah stood beside Jane for most of the evening, which was noted by everyone in the room in various degrees of approval, and from Randall Mercer's direction, disapproval. Randall had come from the next town for the occasion, and he planted himself near the punch bowl with an expression that suggested he was witnessing an injustice, which Jane ignored with practiced ease. At one point in the evening, the fiddle player shifted into a slower tune, and Clara materialized at Jane's elbow with the expression of an angel in a western dress. "You should dance," Clara said brightly, to no one in particular, and then drifted away. Elijah looked at Jane. Jane looked at Elijah. "The August social," she said, "I declined. You had a headache. The July social I declined again. You were tired." "I was," she said. "I was both of those things. I am neither of them tonight." He held out his hand. She took it. They danced, and they were not perfectly matched in the technical sense because Jane had been dancing at frontier socials her whole life and Elijah was good but not exceptional. But what they had was the rhythm of 2 people who have been paying close attention to each other for months and know, without discussion, how to move in the same direction. The lamplight was warm around them and the fiddle was sweet, and the room around them fell away in the way that rooms sometimes do. She looked up at him. He was looking at her. Neither of them said anything, and nothing needed to be said, because some things are fully communicated without words, and this was one of them. January came, and Elijah bought the 60-acre parcel. The purchase was completed at the beginning of the month, witnessed by the county clerk in the next town over. And when Elijah told Jane, she was standing in her kitchen with flour on her hands from the bread she was making. And she listened to the particulars, and then she said, very simply, "Welcome to the neighborhood," and went back to her bread. And he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that Clara had poured him and watched her work with an expression that contained everything. In the weeks after, when the weather allowed, he began working the new parcel, clearing, planning, mapping the use of the land in the methodical way he approached all physical problems. He asked Jane's opinion on the placement of a future barn and on the best section for a kitchen garden, and she gave her opinions plainly and clearly, and he listened and took them seriously, which was, she thought, among the more genuinely attractive qualities a person could possess. Clara, meanwhile, had developed a friendship with a young schoolteacher named Joseph Hale, who had come to Caldwell Creek in November to take over the school from the retired Mr. Porter. Joseph was 22 and earnest and kind and slightly overwhelmed by Clara's energy, which was considerable, but he seemed to be finding his footing. Jane watched this with the alert interest of an older sister and the private hope that Clara might find something good, because Clara deserved something good, and Joseph Hale had the look of someone who understood what deserving meant. February brought a storm, a real one, the kind that the Kansas plains produce with occasional theatrical enthusiasm. 2 days of wind and snow that shut down the roads and kept everyone in and made the world outside the windows a white, shrieking nothing. Jane and Clara were snug with their wood supply and their stores, and Elijah sent Pete down with a note on the first morning of the storm assuring Jane that he was settled and well, and asking the same of her, and Jane sent Pete back with a note confirming that they were fine, and that there was bread if Pete wanted to eat before the ride back, which Pete did, because ranch hands and bread are a reliable combination at any temperature. On the second day of the storm, there was a knock at the farmhouse door that was not Pete. It was Elijah himself, arrived on horseback through conditions that were frankly inadvisable, carrying a sack that contained 2 pounds of coffee beans from the cattle company's reserves, and also, it emerged, a book he had finished and thought she might like. He was snow-covered and cold and looked entirely unrepentant about having ridden through a blizzard for the errand. Jane looked at him standing in her doorway dripping snow on the threshold. "You rode through this storm to bring me coffee and a book," she said. "The coffee is a practical concern," he said. "People need coffee, the book was extra." She stood aside and let him in and took his coat and hung it by the stove and poured him something hot. And they sat at the table while the storm raged outside and Clara worked on her sewing in the corner, and the three of them were warmed together in a way that felt settled and right, like something that had always been this shape and had only just now been recognized. Later, after supper, when Clara had gone to bed and the storm had eased to a steady, quieter snowfall, Elijah and Jane sat by the fire. The book was on the table between them. It was a novel she had not read, and she had looked at it with genuine interest and genuine pleasure. The fire was low and golden. The storm was gentle now, the wind reduced to a soft, steady sound against the walls. "Elijah," she said, "I have been thinking." He waited the way he always waited, without hurry, without filling the space with his own noise. "I do not need more time," she said. He was quiet. She could see him taking that in, understanding it. "You said in December that you were hoping to marry me," she said. "When it was right, I am telling you it is right." He set down his cup. He turned to face her fully. In the firelight, his eyes were very warm and very steady. "Jane," he said. "I know what I want," she said. "I have known for a while. I was afraid, which is a reasonable response to having lost people you love, but I am not afraid of this. I have decided not to be." "You have decided not to be afraid," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite laughter but was close to it, close to the thing that happiness makes in a voice when it is real. "I find it is a choice to some extent," she said. "You make the choice enough times and it becomes something you can do." He reached across and took her hand. The first time he had done that, not in a formal social context, but here, in her own house, by the fire, in the small hours of a storm. His hand was warm and larger than hers, and she held it. "I will ask you properly," he said, "when I have a ring, which will be soon." "You do not need a ring," she said. "I want one," he said, "for the asking. You deserve the asking done properly." She looked at him. "All right," she said, and the warmth that moved through her was not just from the fire. He kept his word. 3 weeks later, on a clear February morning with the snow bright and hard on the fields and the sky a brilliant blue, he knocked on the farmhouse door in his best coat with his hat in one hand and a small box in the other. Jane answered the door and looked at him and looked at the box and felt her heart do something that she had no dignified name for. He opened the box. The ring was a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, which caught the February light and turned it red. He had bought it from a jeweler in Wichita, which meant he had made the trip specifically, which had required 2 days of travel. "Jane Elizabeth Shelton," he said, and his voice was steady because he was a steady man, but she could see in his face that steady was requiring some effort, which she found more endearing than she had words for. "I would like to spend the rest of my life in your proximity. Would you marry me?" She smiled. It was the full, complete smile, the one that changed her face. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He put the ring on her finger and stood up, and they stood in the doorway of the farmhouse with the February sun bright around them, and he kissed her for the first time, which was not the extravagant kind of kiss that novels describe when they want to make a point, but was instead quiet and warm and certain, the kind of kiss that is less an event and more a statement of fact. She kissed him back with the same quality, certain, decided, true. Clara appeared in the hallway behind Jane with her hands over her mouth and tears running down her face, because Clara felt things fully and made no apology for it. Joseph Hale, who had apparently been invited to witness the occasion and had been waiting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and admirable patience, stood beside Clara and looked at the scene with the expression of a man storing up something precious. The wedding was held in April. Jane had never been a woman who dreamed of elaborate weddings, which was just as well because Caldwell Creek in 1875 was not a place that produced them. But she had imagined, somewhere in the private part of herself, she did not often display, a wedding that felt real, not performed, not theatrical, but genuinely celebratory in the way that important things deserve to be celebrated. The little white church at the end of Caldwell Creek's Main Street had been decorated with wildflowers that Clara and Mrs. Whitfield and the barber's wife had gathered from the meadows east of town, which were beginning to open in the spring warmth. The pews were full. Caldwell Creek turned out for weddings the way small towns do, completely and with genuine investment, because, in a community that size, everyone's significant events belong a little bit to everyone. Tom Whitfield sat in the front row with his wife, who had recovered fully from her winter illness and was wearing her good blue dress and openly crying, which she had earned the right to do. The Patton family was there. Mr. Tibbs, the postmaster, was there, sitting very upright with the expression of a man who has witnessed something important passing through his office and is quietly satisfied with how it turned out. Pete from the cattle company sat in the back row in a clean shirt, looking very young and very pleased with himself. Clara walked Jane down the aisle, because their father was gone and Clara was the family that remained, and there was no shame in it and no lesser quality to it. If anything, it was precisely right. The two of them walked together, Jane in her best dress, which was a deep blue that Clara had helped her sew over the winter from the finest fabric available at the Patton store, and Clara in the calico birthday dress, and they walked together down the aisle with the dignity and the private grief and the private joy all mixed together the way things mix in real life. Elijah was at the front of the church in his good coat, and he watched Jane walk toward him with the expression of a man who has waited for something and received it and cannot quite believe his luck, and she walked toward him looking at that expression and thinking that she would remember it for the rest of her life, and she did. The ceremony was performed by Pastor Henderson, a quiet man who gave good sermons and kept them appropriately short. The vows were the traditional ones of the era, spoken plainly and meant fully, and when Elijah said his, he said them to Jane's eyes and not to the room, which she felt rather than consciously registered but would think about later. When the pastor pronounced them married and Elijah kissed her, the church erupted in the enthusiastic fashion of a small frontier community that takes its celebrations seriously, and Clara made a sound that was simultaneously a laugh and a sob, and Tom Whitfield clapped with the whole force of his 60-year-old hands, and even Mr. Tibbs permitted himself a small, satisfied smile. They had their celebration in the church fellowship hall, the same room where Jane had declined to dance twice, and then finally danced once on Christmas Eve. And there was food and music and genuine festivity that went until the stars were well established overhead. Joe Hale danced with Clara 4 times, which everyone noticed and approved of, and Elijah danced with Jane more than anyone, and she let herself enjoy it without analysis or armor, just the straightforward pleasure of dancing with someone you have chosen and who has chosen you in return. They went home to the Shelton farmhouse that night, which would be their home for now while Elijah built on his parcel. The house was quiet and familiar and warm, and the life that was waiting for them inside it was their own. The months that followed were the business of being married, which is both simpler and more complex than anything that happens before it. They were two people with strong characters and established habits and independent methods, and the negotiation of how two such people share a life required daily and genuine attention, the kind that neither of them was too proud or too rigid to give. They disagreed about some things. Jane thought fences needed to be repaired in a particular sequence. Elijah thought she was wrong about the sequence, and said so, and she said that was fine and they could try his way, and then she would be proven right, which was such a perfect representation of her entire approach to disagreement that he laughed, and then they talked it through, and came to a middle position that was actually better than either original, which Jane acknowledged with a directness that he had come to love absolutely. He was building on his parcel throughout the spring and summer, spending long days working the structure of a house that he described to Jane in detail, the width of the rooms, the placement of the windows to catch the morning light, the kitchen that was big enough for two people who both knew how to cook to work in at the same time without disaster. She listened to these descriptions with attention and offered her opinions, which he solicited and actually used, which continued to be among his most attractive qualities. By October, the house was framed and roofed, and by December, it was livable, not finished in every detail but solid and warm and theirs, set on the 60 acres that bordered Jane's own land, with a view that encompassed both parcels and the long sweep of prairie beyond them. They moved in on a December morning, 1 year after Clara had set a table for 3 and Joseph Hale had waited in the kitchen with his coffee. Clara stayed at the farmhouse, because she was 19 and capable and the farm was her home too, and also because Joseph Hale had, in November, quietly taken Clara's hand during a walk along the creek and said something that made Clara come home with a face so luminous that Jane had known without being told, and the news that they were to be married in the spring confirmed it. Jane and Elijah's new house was warm and full of the particular quality that new houses have when they are lived in from the beginning by people who intend to stay. The wood smoke from the first fires, the way their particular objects look in the spaces they have chosen for them, the specific quality of light at different hours that they learn together, day by day. Their land combined, in practice if not yet in formal documentation, made 100 acres of productive Kansas farmland, which was not a fortune but was a real and solid thing. Elijah brought his knowledge of cattle and range management, and Jane brought her knowledge of grain farming and homestead operation, and together they had something more complete than either had alone. They hired 2 hands in the spring, both of them grown men looking for stable work, one of whom, a man named Aurelio Cruz, had come north from Texas, and had a family in Mexico that he was sending money to, a situation that reminded Elijah of his own years of working without a place to call his own, and he made sure the wages were fair and the housing was decent, which Jane supported entirely. By the following autumn, Jane knew she was carrying their first child. She told Elijah on a Saturday morning in the kitchen, straight out, the way she told him everything directly with her eyes on his. She watched his face change through several things rapidly: surprise, understanding, and then something so utterly unguarded that she reached across the table and took his hand, the same gesture he had first made toward her by the fire 2 winters ago. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I feel fine," she said. "I feel very well, actually." He held her hand and said nothing for a moment, looking at her with the expression of a man who has been given something he did not let himself hope too specifically for. "A child," he said. "Yes. Our child. That is generally how it works," she said, and the lightness in her voice made him laugh, and the laugh broke whatever tension had been holding the moment formal, and he came around the table and put his arms around her, and she let herself be held in the particular way that she had come to understand was entirely safe, not trapping or diminishing, just warm and present and real. The winter was gentler that year, or perhaps seemed so because of what was growing in it. Jane worked the farm at a pace that she adjusted honestly as the months passed, something that required overcoming a deep stubbornness about appearing anything other than fully capable. But she managed it because Elijah was matter-of-fact about the adjustments, not hovering or overcautious, just present and responsive in the practical ways that actually helped. He took on the heavier outdoor work without discussion and without making it a statement, and she ran the house and the business correspondence and the planning, which she was better at than he was and which he acknowledged with the cheerful honesty that was one of his best qualities. Clara and Joseph Hale married in April, in the same church with the same wildflowers, and Clara moved into the schoolteacher's modest house in town, and the farmhouse that had been Jane's family's became, after some discussion, the property of both sisters in the joint legal arrangement that Elijah helped them document correctly, with the intention of renting it to a new family who needed good land. It was the right thing and also the practical thing, and Jane said goodbye to the house one afternoon when no one else was there, walking through the rooms and saying what she needed to say to the air, which carried it wherever it needed to go. Their son was born on a Saturday morning in June, with the summer sun coming through the bedroom window and the meadowlarks in the field, and the sound of Aurelio working in the yard below, because the world does not stop for the arrival of new people. It just continues alongside. He came into the world with considerable energy and opinion, which Jane considered appropriate given his parentage. Elijah sat beside the bed and held his son and his wife's hand at the same time in the afterward, when the doctor had gone, and the house was quiet, and the June afternoon was golden outside the window, and the expression on Elijah's face was one Jane stored somewhere in the permanent section of her memory, filed alongside the letters and the barn roof and the first kiss in a February doorway. "What shall we call him?" Elijah said. They had talked about names and had not settled on one, which was intentional. They had wanted to wait and see who arrived. Jane looked at the small, red-faced, opinionated person in Elijah's arms. "Henry," she said, "after my father." Elijah looked at her. "Henry Vaughan," he said. "Henry Edward Vaughan," she said. "Edward was your father's name." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "it was." "Whatever else he was," she said, "he is part of you, and you are the best man I know, so the name should be here too." He looked at their son with the particular look of a man rearranging something inside himself, setting something down that he had been carrying for a long time. "Henry Edward Vaughan," he said, and the name settled. The boy was healthy and loud and fascinated by everything, and he grew with the satisfying momentum of a child who has arrived in the world with full intention of making the most of it. He was walking by the time the following summer arrived, and talking, in the specific and determined fashion of a child with two parents who took words seriously, by the autumn after that. Clara had her own news the spring after Henry was born. She and Joseph were expecting. And Clara told Jane at the kitchen table of the new house, both of them with tea, and the circle that had been two sisters managing alone was now something larger and warmer and differently arranged, which felt like the right kind of change. The years that followed, and this story deserves its years, deserves the full account of them, were years of the kind of life that does not make for dramatic narrating, because dramatic things happen in the spaces of it rather than as its constant condition. They were years of work and season and harvest, of the land teaching them things they had to learn to understand, of two parcels grown into one operational whole, with a good reputation in the county for honest dealing and solid grain. There were harder times worked into the fabric of those years. A drought in 1877 that took a significant portion of the winter wheat and required renegotiating with the seed supplier and making careful decisions about what was spent and what was saved. And there was no panic in that kitchen during those conversations, just two people working a problem together with all the combined competence they had. The drought broke in late summer, and the following year was good. There were also the larger troubles of the era that touched the lives of everyone in that country, including the ongoing displacement of the native peoples of the Great Plains, the Osage, the Kansa, the Cheyenne, whose land this had been, and who were being pushed further and further by the same westward pressure that had brought Elijah to Kansas and kept Jane there. Elijah and Jane were not unaware of this. It was not a comfortable awareness, but they held it honestly, the knowledge that the land they were building on was land with a history that preceded their claim to it, that the territory around them had been reorganized by force and policy in ways that were unjust regardless of what the law said about it. They could not undo what had been done, but they chose to see it clearly rather than look away, which was what honest people in complicated situations could do. The cattle trade that had brought Elijah to Caldwell Creek was changing too, as the decade moved forward. The big trail drives of longhorns from Texas were giving way to more local ranching as the Kansas counties fenced and farmed, and the range that had seemed infinite turned out to be finite and contested, and the era of the open range was closing with the methodical certainty of a door at the end of a hall. Elijah had seen this coming and had made his decisions accordingly. The land, the farm, the choice to build rather than drive, and those decisions proved sound. Aurelio Cruz sent for his family in 1878, and his wife, Carmen, and their two children arrived from Texas in the late summer. And Carmen turned out to be a remarkable cook, and an even more remarkable businesswoman who had ideas about expanding the household garden into a commercial vegetable operation that sold to the town, which Jane and Carmen developed together with considerable mutual respect and the occasional disagreement that was the byproduct of two equally capable women with strong opinions, and which always resolved into something better than either of them had started with. Henry grew. He was tall like his father and had his mother's eyes and his mother's stubbornness and his father's patience, which was an unusual combination that would serve him extremely well in life, though he did not know this yet and was currently primarily interested in horses and in making friends with every dog in a 3-mile radius. Jane found herself pregnant again in 1879, and this time it was a daughter, born in the spring, who arrived with the focused intensity of someone who has waited long enough and has opinions about the delay. They named her Rose after Elijah's mother, whose full name had been Rosemary and who had been, by Elijah's account, a woman of considerable intelligence and quiet strength, which seemed to describe the small, fierce person who had joined their household. Henry received his sister with the combination of suspicion and fascination that marks the beginning of a sibling relationship, and by the time Rose was pulling herself up to standing by the furniture, Henry had appointed himself her protector and tour guide to the world in a capacity that no one had asked him to fill, but which he held with absolute seriousness. Clara and Joseph had two children now as well as a son, Michael, who was a year older than Rose, and a daughter, Ellie, who was a few months younger. The cousins grew up in each other's orbits, which was the particular gift of family proximity, and the two households moved in and out of each other's lives with the comfortable frequency of people who have decided that family is a daily practice rather than a formal occasion. In 1880, Caldwell Creek got its own post office expansion, a proper postal building, separate from the barbershop, which Mr. Tibbs occupied with the satisfaction of a man whose career has finally received appropriate accommodation. The town was growing, slowly but genuinely, with a new hotel and a second general store, and a doctor who had come from St. Louis with his wife and who was, by the testimony of the entire community, excellent at his work. The railroad, which had passed 20 miles north in the 1870s, was now rumored to be sending a branch south, which would transform Caldwell Creek in ways that were both exciting and slightly melancholy, because small towns always lose something when they become larger towns, even when what they gain is useful. Jane and Elijah talked about this on the porch of the house on September evenings, with the children inside and the prairie going dark around them and the stars coming in from the east, and they agreed that what they had built here would not be diminished by the town's growth, because what they had built was inside the house and on the land and between each other, and those things were not changed by what happened on the main street. One evening in the September of that year, sitting on that porch, Elijah reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper with the air of someone who has been waiting for the right moment. "What is that?" Jane said. "A letter," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the stars with the smallest private smile. "Elijah Vaughn," she said, "if you have written me a letter while sitting beside me on this porch, I am going to—" "It is the first letter," he said. "The one from August, the one you burned." She stopped. He unfolded it. In the lamplight from the window behind them she could see the familiar handwriting. "I rewrote it," he said, "from memory as best I could. I wanted you to be able to read it, eventually." She took it from him. She read the letter that she had burned in August of 1874, reconstructed in his honest handwriting, which she now knew as well as her own. It said essentially what she had understood it would say, what she had been afraid it would say, because she was not ready in August, and she had known that she was not ready, and it said it in his particular voice, plain, direct, warm without being sentimental, honest without being heavy-handed. It said that he had met her in the patent store and thought she was remarkable, and would she do him the courtesy of corresponding, and that he understood entirely if she would rather not. Jane read it once and then again. The stars were out fully now, and the night insects were singing in the grass, and somewhere in the house behind them Henry was asleep with the total commitment of a 6-year-old, and Rose was asleep with the focused intensity she brought to everything, and the farm was quiet and good in theirs. "I should have read it the first time," she said. "Perhaps," he said. "But then you might not have needed to walk 6 miles in November, and I think that walk was important." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you chose it," he said. "Not because a letter persuaded you, because you decided yourself to come to me." She held the letter. The handwriting in the lamplight was familiar and dear and 6 years old, and she thought about the woman who had stood at a fireplace and burned it, and she thought about who she was now, and the distance between those 2 points was not a distance of failure but of travel, real travel, the kind that changes you. "You kept the line from the outside of the envelope," she said, reading the last line of the letter. He had added it at the end, the line that had changed everything. "I am not going anywhere, Jane, and I am not in any hurry, but I want you to know I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever had the good fortune to sit beside on a barn roof." "It was part of the letter," he said. "It just arrived late." She folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands and looked at the prairie under the stars. "I am glad you sent it again," she said. "So am I," he said. She leaned against him, which was a thing she did now without thinking, naturally, the way you lean against a wall that you know with absolute certainty is going to hold. His arm came around her, also naturally, also without thought, the practiced ease of two people who have been close enough long enough that the closeness is its own form of knowledge. The stars burned bright and cold over Kansas, the way they had burned every night of the 6 years since a woman had burned a letter, and a man had sent it again with one extra line, and the prairie stretched out around them enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the house behind them held their sleeping children and their life, and all the threads of that life were gathered in and tied the farm, the land, the town, the family, the grief that had been carried and set down, the love that had been feared and then chosen, the ordinary, extraordinary business of two people building something together in a wild and demanding country. Henry would wake in the morning and want to check on the horses before breakfast, which he did every morning, and Rose would wake with opinions about the day's schedule, which she had every morning, and Aurelio and Carmen would be in the yard by sunup, and Clara and Joseph would come on Sunday as they always did, and the wheat would need attention, and the fences would need checking, and the business of the 100 acres would be the business of the 100 acres, ongoing and requiring and real. And in the years after, the children grew, and the farm grew, and the town grew, and the century turned, eventually, as centuries do. And Henry Vaughan became a young man who had his father's patience and his mother's clear eyes, and who could read the sky for weather the way his grandfather had taught his mother to do on a summer afternoon when she was 12 years old. And Rose Vaughan became exactly the focused, intelligent, generous person that the intensity of her arrival had promised. And she went to school in Wichita and came back with ideas and energy, and a respect for the prairie that she had grown up knowing in her bones. And Elijah Vaughan, who had come to Caldwell Creek to do the business of cattle and had not anticipated Jane Shelton, spent the rest of his life in the proximity he had asked for, and received on 100 acres of good Kansas land beside the woman he had written 2 letters to, and would have written 100 more if that was what it took, though it had, in the end, taken only 2 and 1 extra line. And Jane Shelton Vaughan, who had burned 1 letter and returned 1 letter, and then walked 6 miles in November to find a man in a pasture fixing a fence, spent the rest of her life making the choice she had made that November afternoon, renewed daily in the way that real choices are, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a series of mornings accumulated. She kept the rewritten letter in the cedar box where she kept the important papers, beside the deed to the land and their marriage certificate, and a small photograph taken in Wichita the year Rose was born, and she took it out sometimes to read it, not because she needed to, but because some things deserve to be revisited, the way you revisit a beautiful piece of country, not because you have forgotten it, but because you want to see it again. The evening star came out over the prairie the same as it always had, patient and reliable, and the grass moved in the wind, and the sky went through all its colors in the daily show that costs nothing and gives everything. And in the house on the 100 acres outside Caldwell Creek, Kansas, the lamp burned in the window, and the door was unlocked, and there was always enough for whoever came. That was how it ended and how it continued, which is the only ending worth having, not a stop but a going on, settled and whole, with everything resolved and everything at peace, and the two of them together in the life they had built from a burned letter and a returned letter and 1 extra line, and the particular courage of a woman who walked 6 miles in November to say yes.